The words, 2 minutes, should never come from a pilot's mouth. But when Captain David Richardson's voice crackled over the intercom of Flight 1843 that Tuesday morning, strained with barely controlled desperation, those 2 words sent ice through the veins of every person aboard, because everyone instantly understood they weren't talking about a delay or a minor issue, they were talking about how long 246 people had left to live. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. It was 10:47 a.m. when American Airlines Flight 1843 from Chicago O'Hare to Los Angeles began dying. The Boeing 777 had been cruising smoothly at 39,000 feet, somewhere over the endless plains of Kansas. Passengers settled into that comfortable mid-flight routine of reading, watching movies, or dozing while flight attendants prepared the lunch service. Seat 23F held Dr. Rachel Martinez, a 42-year-old woman in jeans and a plain gray sweater, reading a paperback thriller and sipping coffee that had gone lukewarm in her cup. To the businessman in 23E checking his email, to the college student in 23D with headphones blasting music, Rachel was just another middle-aged passenger on another routine flight. Nobody had any reason to pay attention to her. Nobody knew that her entire career had prepared her for a moment that shouldn't be possible. The first indication something was catastrophically wrong came not from passenger-facing announcements but from the sudden change in engine sound that experienced travelers instinctively recognize as abnormal. The smooth drone shifted, became uneven, and the aircraft's attitude subtly changed in ways that made stomachs tighten with primitive recognition that something was wrong with the massive machine keeping them suspended miles above Earth. In the cockpit, Captain Richardson and First Officer Maria Santos were staring at their instrument panels with mounting horror as warning alarms began cascading across their displays. Red lights that should never illuminate were blazing with urgent demand for attention. The flight control computer was displaying failure warnings that Richardson had never seen in 23 years of flying, that training simulators rarely bothered programming because they represented scenarios that shouldn't occur on properly maintained aircraft. Primary hydraulic pressure dropping in System 1, Santos reported, her voice tight and professional despite the fear evident in her eyes. Compensating to System 2. Wait, System 2 showing anomalous readings, pressure fluctuating. I see it, Richardson interrupted, his hands moving across controls with practiced efficiency, attempting the initial troubleshooting procedures that every commercial pilot trains for extensively. Running emergency checklist for dual hydraulic anomaly. But the checklists weren't helping because what was happening to Flight 1843 exceeded the parameters that checklists addressed. The warnings kept escalating, spreading across systems in patterns that suggested not isolated component failure but something far worse, actual structural damage to the mechanical systems that translated pilot inputs into aircraft control. Dave, Santos said quietly, using his first name in violation of cockpit protocol in a way that conveyed the severity of what she was seeing. The control linkage integrity monitors are showing physical separation warnings. That's not software. That's not electronics. Something is physically breaking back there. Richardson felt cold sweat on his back despite the cockpit's climate control. Physical separation of control linkages meant the mechanical components that connected their control yokes to the aircraft's flight surfaces, the cables, rods, and hydraulic actuators that physically moved the ailerons, elevators, and rudder, were coming apart. You couldn't fix that with procedures or computer reboots. Those were physical systems that required hands-on mechanical repair, and they were at 39,000 feet with no way to access the systems while in flight. How bad, he asked, already knowing the answer would be terrible. Santos was pulling up diagnostic data, her fingers flying across the touchscreen displays. Primary flight control actuator assembly showing critical stress indicators. Backup linkages are taking load they weren't designed for. If the primary linkages fail completely and the backups cascade under the stress, she stopped, not needing to finish the sentence. They both knew what complete flight control failure meant. Richardson attempted a gentle control input, testing the response. The aircraft reacted sluggishly, with a lag that shouldn't exist, with a mushiness that indicated mechanical problems between his controls and the actual flight surfaces. He tried a slightly more aggressive input and felt resistance, then sudden give, as if something had slipped or broken under the increased load. "We're losing mechanical control authority," he said quietly. "This isn't hydraulic pressure issues. The physical linkages are failing. I can feel it in the controls." They worked desperately through every emergency procedure they knew, coordinating with company maintenance through radio, describing the symptoms to engineers on the ground who sounded increasingly alarmed as they understood what the failure pattern indicated. 20 minutes of troubleshooting produced nothing but escalating warnings and progressive deterioration of control response. Whatever was failing back in the mechanical systems was getting worse, not better, and nothing they could do from the cockpit was stopping it. "American 1843, this is company maintenance," the radio crackled. "Based on your description and the diagnostic telemetry we're receiving, you appear to be experiencing catastrophic failure of the primary flight control mechanical assembly. We're seeing stress indicators that suggest imminent structural separation of critical linkages. You need to begin immediate emergency descent and plan for landing at the nearest suitable airport." "Nearest suitable is Wichita," Santos reported, already pulling up approach data. 53 miles northeast of our current position." Richardson calculated timing in his head, comparing their deteriorating control authority against the distance to safety. The aircraft was becoming progressively harder to control, requiring larger inputs to achieve smaller responses, behaving like a car with failing steering that made even simple maneuvers feel dangerous. And the warnings kept escalating, the red lights multiplying, the computer's calm voice announcing failures with mechanical indifference to the fact that each announcement brought them closer to the moment when the pilots would have no way to control this aircraft at all. "Beginning emergency descent," Richardson announced, both to his co-pilot and to air traffic control. "American 1843 declaring emergency. We have critical flight control failure, requesting priority handling for immediate landing Wichita." The descent should have been routine: reduce power, lower nose, let the aircraft drop quickly but in controlled fashion. Except the controls fought him with every input, responding unpredictably, the aircraft's behavior suggesting that the mechanical connections between his control yoke and the actual flight surfaces were degrading with every passing second. He felt something slip in the controls, a sudden loss of resistance followed by different resistance, as if a cable had snapped and load had transferred to a backup that wasn't designed to handle it alone. "Control response is degrading faster than projected," Santos said, her professional calm starting to crack. "We're not going to make Wichita with these deterioration rates." Richardson knew she was right. The math was brutally simple: they needed approximately 8 minutes to descend and cover the distance to Wichita. Their control authority was failing at a rate that gave them maybe 3 minutes before the aircraft became completely uncontrollable. After that point, no amount of pilot skill would matter because the physical mechanisms that translated their inputs into aircraft movement would be gone, separated, broken beyond any cockpit procedure's ability to compensate. "Give me options," he said quietly. "We don't have good options." Santos's voice was steady but her hands were shaking slightly as she worked her controls. "We can't fix physical mechanical failures from here. We need maintenance personnel with tools and parts, and we're at 39,000 feet. There's no emergency procedure for, flight control linkages are physically breaking apart." Another warning tone, this one more urgent than the others. Richardson glanced at the new alert and felt his stomach drop. The backup control linkages were now showing critical stress. When those failed, and they would fail soon under the loads they were carrying, there would be nothing left. No more backups. No more redundancy. Just complete loss of control and a certain plunge that would kill everyone aboard. He looked at Santos, saw his own fear reflected in her eyes, and made the decision he'd hoped never to make in his entire career. "I need to tell them," he said. Santos nodded slowly. "How much time do we actually have?" Richardson studied the failure progression data, did the grim calculation, and arrived at a number that made him want to vomit. 2 minutes. Maybe less. After that, we lose everything. He keyed the intercom, taking one steadying breath before speaking. His voice came out strained but clear, carrying the weight of impending catastrophe to everyone in the cabin. This is the captain. We have a critical mechanical failure in our flight control systems. We have approximately 2 minutes before we lose the ability to control this aircraft. I need everyone to assume crash positions immediately. Flight attendants, prepare for emergency landing. The cabin erupted into chaos. The announcement that had been meant to prepare passengers for impact instead ignited pure terror as 246 people simultaneously understood they had 2 minutes to live. Parents grabbed children, couples clutched each other, lone travelers stared in disbelief at seatbacks that offered no answers. Flight attendants moved through the aisles with professionalism honed by training even as their faces showed they understood the horrifying truth. Emergency procedures only mattered if the pilots could control the aircraft, and the captain had just announced they were about to lose that ability entirely. A teenage girl in 12B was crying hysterically. An elderly man in 18C was frantically typing on his phone, trying to send final messages to family. A mother in 7A held her 2 children while sobbing. All around the cabin, people were confronting their own mortality in ways that training and procedures could never prepare anyone for, accepting that mechanical failure was killing them and there was nothing anyone could do. In seat 23F, Rachel Martinez went absolutely still. Her paperback thriller dropped to her lap as her engineering mind parsed what the captain had just said. Critical mechanical failure in flight control systems. 2 minutes before loss of control. She'd heard that type of failure pattern before, not in commercial aviation but during her years designing and maintaining military aircraft flight control systems. She'd spent 15 years as a senior aerospace engineer specializing in the exact mechanical linkages the captain was describing, had personally worked on emergency repairs of damaged flight control assemblies, had designed some of the backup systems that were probably failing right now in the aircraft around her. The businessman in 23E was praying, his eyes closed, hands gripping the armrests. The college student in 23D had gone pale and motionless with shock. Neither paid any attention to Rachel as she unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, her mind racing through the technical knowledge that suddenly transformed from theoretical expertise into immediate life-or-death relevance. She knew exactly what was happening. The captain's description, mechanical failure in flight control systems, complete loss of control imminent, indicated catastrophic structural damage to the actuator linkages and hydraulic assemblies that physically moved the aircraft's control surfaces. This wasn't an electronics problem that computers could solve. This was physical, mechanical destruction of the hardware that connected pilot inputs to actual aircraft movement. From the cockpit, the pilots couldn't access those systems. Standard procedures couldn't fix physical mechanical failures. You needed hands-on intervention from someone who understood the mechanical systems well enough to perform emergency field repairs. Rachel had designed those systems. She'd maintained them. She'd performed emergency repairs on damaged aircraft during her military contractor years. And she knew something that most passengers and even most pilots didn't know. There were emergency mechanical access panels in commercial aircraft cockpits, hidden maintenance hatches designed to allow ground crews to access critical flight control linkages for repairs. They existed in case of failures too severe to wait for hangar maintenance. They weren't supposed to be used during flight, but they existed, and Rachel knew where they were and what could be done with them. 2 minutes. The captain had said 2 minutes. That gave her maybe 90 seconds of workable time if she could get into the cockpit immediately. She stood in the aisle, ignoring the chaos around her, and shouted with an authority that cut through the cabin panic like a blade, "Open the cockpit. I can fix it." Several passengers nearby turned to stare at her with expressions ranging from confusion to irritation that someone was adding to the chaos. A flight attendant was rushing past and stopped, looking at Rachel with the trained patience of someone dealing with a passenger having a panic attack. "Ma'am, you need to return to your seat and assume crash position. I'm an aircraft systems engineer." Rachel interrupted, her voice carrying the desperate authority of absolute certainty. "I specialize in flight control mechanical assemblies. The failure the captain described is physical mechanical damage that can be temporarily stabilized if I can access the systems. I need into that cockpit now or everyone on this aircraft dies in. She glanced at her watch, 90 seconds. The flight attendant, whose name tag read Jennifer, hesitated. Her training said keep passengers in seats during emergencies. But something in Rachel's tone, in the technical specificity of her words, in the urgent competence radiating from this woman who moments ago had been just another anonymous passenger, made Jennifer pause. "You're what?" Jennifer asked, needing confirmation. "Aerospace engineer, 15 years specializing in flight control systems," Rachel said rapidly, her words coming in controlled bursts of information. "I designed hydraulic actuator assemblies for military aircraft. I know the mechanical linkages that are failing. There's an emergency access panel behind the captain's seat that allows direct access to the primary flight control mechanical assembly. I can rig temporary linkages that will give them partial control authority. But I have maybe 90 seconds before complete cascade failure and then everyone dies. Open the door." Jennifer stared at her for one endless second, calculating, deciding, accepting the insane risk because the alternative was certain death. She ran toward the cockpit, punching in the emergency access code while Rachel followed, her mind already visualizing the systems she'd need to access, the repairs she'd need to attempt, the improvised solutions that might save 246 people if her hands were fast enough and her knowledge was accurate enough. The cockpit door opened. Captain Richardson turned in his seat, shock and confusion on his face at the breach of security during emergency, but Rachel was already pushing past him with focused intensity. "I'm Dr. Rachel Martinez, aerospace engineer specializing in flight control systems," she said rapidly while moving toward the back of the cockpit. "You're experiencing catastrophic failure of the primary mechanical linkage assembly connecting your controls to actual flight surfaces. I need to access the emergency maintenance panel behind your seat. Keep trying to maintain control. What I'm about to do will feel strange, but it's your only chance." "What are you?" Richardson started, but Rachel was already tearing open the access panel he hadn't even known existed in his own cockpit, revealing the nightmare of hydraulic lines, mechanical linkages, and control cables that normally remained hidden behind smooth panels that made cockpits look clean and manageable. She looked into the mechanical chaos and immediately saw the catastrophic failure. A primary actuator linkage, a critical rod that translated control yoke movement into hydraulic actuator motion, had fractured. She could see the crack spreading along the metal, see the backup linkage taking stress it wasn't designed to handle, see hydraulic fluid leaking from seals that were failing under abnormal pressure. This was exactly the failure pattern she'd studied extensively during her military contractor years, the nightmare scenario that aircraft designers tried to prevent with redundancy but which could still occur when catastrophic structural damage overwhelmed multiple safety systems simultaneously. 70 seconds, she muttered to herself, pulling off her belt and yanking the fire extinguisher from its mount on the cockpit wall. She'd need improvised tools, improvised materials, improvised solutions to problems that normally required specialized equipment and hours of careful maintenance work. She had 1 minute to compress everything she'd learned in 15 years of aerospace engineering into emergency field repairs that had to work perfectly on the first attempt. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency born from thousands of maintenance procedures. She used the fire extinguisher bracket as a lever, applying controlled force to shift the fractured linkage slightly out of alignment so she could work around it. The backup linkage was taking full load and she could see stress fractures beginning to form. 30 more seconds and it would fail completely, taking away the last thread of control authority the pilots had. Rachel tore her belt into strips, using the leather to create improvised binding around the fractured primary linkage. It wouldn't restore full strength, but it might take some load off the backup. She wrapped it tight, using techniques she'd learned doing emergency repairs on battle-damaged aircraft, applying pressure in ways that would make the temporary repair hold just long enough. 50 seconds. Santos called out, monitoring the failure progression on her instruments. Backup linkage stress at 93%. "I know." Rachel shouted back, her hands bleeding now from wrestling with sharp metal edges and hydraulic fittings that weren't designed for bare-handed manipulation. She reached deeper into the mechanical assembly, finding the hydraulic routing that fed the failing actuators. There, a bypass valve that ground crews used during maintenance to manually route hydraulic pressure around damaged sections. She forced it open with the fire extinguisher bracket used as an improvised wrench, her muscles straining against the resistance. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across her arms as pressure suddenly rerouted, but she ignored it, working frantically to manually configure the backup hydraulic pathways that the automated system should have engaged but which had failed to activate properly during the cascade failure. She was doing maintenance that normally required 3 technicians with specialized tools, doing it alone with improvised equipment while the aircraft plummeted and a countdown to death ticked away in everyone's minds. 30 seconds. Richardson called, and Rachel could hear the barely controlled terror in his voice as he felt his controls becoming progressively less responsive, as the aircraft behaved more like a falling boulder than a controlled machine, as his training and skills became meaningless because the physical mechanisms translating his inputs into aircraft movement were disappearing. Rachel's hands moved faster, implementing emergency mechanical bridges that textbooks said were impossible during flight. She grabbed a hydraulic coupling and forced it into a position that created a direct bypass around the damaged primary actuator, using her belt leather as improvised sealing around connections that wouldn't mate properly without proper gaskets. It was a hack, an engineering nightmare that violated every proper maintenance procedure she'd ever learned, but proper procedures took hours and she had seconds. "You're going to feel control response change," she shouted to the pilots while forcing the final improvised connection into place. "It'll be weird, non-standard response curves, but you'll have partial control authority. Use gentle inputs." She wedged the fire extinguisher bracket as a physical stop against the fractured linkage, preventing further separation. It wouldn't hold forever, maybe 20 minutes if they were lucky, but 20 minutes was enough time to land if the pilots were skilled enough to work with compromised controls. 20 seconds, wait, Santos's voice suddenly changed. "I'm getting control response again. It's not normal but I've got, Dave, try your controls." Richardson moved his control yoke cautiously, expecting nothing or expecting complete failure, but instead felt resistance, strange resistance, mushy and imprecise, but actual response. The aircraft's nose came up slightly. The roll attitude that had been drifting uncontrolled suddenly responded to his input. They weren't dead yet. "What did you do back there?" he gasped, his hands working the controls carefully, learning the new feel of the temporary repairs Rachel had implemented. "Temporary mechanical bypass of your failed primary linkage," Rachel said, emerging from behind his seat. Her hands were bleeding, her clothes were soaked with hydraulic fluid, and her face was streaked with sweat and dirt from crawling through mechanical systems. "I've routed hydraulic pressure around the damaged actuator and created improvised load sharing between your primary and backup linkages. You've got maybe 30% of normal control authority, but it's enough to fly if you're gentle. No aggressive maneuvers. Treat it like flying a damaged aircraft, because that's exactly what you're doing." Richardson tested the controls, feeling out the strange new response. It was like flying a different aircraft, sluggish, imprecise, requiring much larger inputs to achieve smaller results, but it responded. He had control. Limited, compromised, temporary control, but after believing for the last 2 minutes that he had no control at all, this felt like a miracle. "Can you get us on the ground?" Rachel asked, gripping the back of his seat as the aircraft descended. "I can try," Richardson said, his voice steadier now that he had something to work with. "What's our time limit on your repairs?" Rachel calculated stress loads in her head, thinking about the improvised materials she'd used, the mechanical principles she'd violated, the temporary nature of everything she'd rigged together in desperate haste. Best case, 20 minutes before something fails again. Worst case, 5 minutes. You need to land this aircraft as fast as possible without doing anything that stresses the control systems beyond what my repairs can handle. Wichita's 10 minutes out, Santos reported. "Dave, you think you can land this?" "I'm going to have to," Richardson said grimly, his hands working the compromised controls as he coordinated with air traffic control for emergency approach. "Everyone hang on. This is going to be rough." The next 8 minutes were the longest of everyone's lives. Richardson flew the crippled aircraft with skills honed over decades, making gentle corrections that accommodated the compromised control systems, maintaining approach speeds that kept stress on Rachel's improvised repairs within survivable ranges. Every pilot input was a calculated risk. Too aggressive and the temporary linkages might fail completely, too gentle and he'd lose control of the approach. He threaded the needle between disaster and catastrophe, flying on instinct and experience while praying that Rachel's emergency repairs held just a little longer. Rachel stayed in the cockpit, monitoring the mechanical systems through sounds and vibrations that her experience taught her to interpret. She listened to the hydraulics, felt the aircraft's responses, watched for signs that her repairs were failing. Twice she told Richardson to ease off inputs that were stressing the systems too much. Once she reached back into the access panel to adjust a connection that was starting to slip. Her hands never stopped bleeding. 5 miles out, Santos called. Gear coming down. Negative on gear yet, Rachel interrupted. The gear deployment will stress your hydraulics in ways that might cascade through to the compromised control linkages. Deploy gear at the last possible moment, 1 mile out, and be ready for control response to change when you do. Richardson followed her guidance, his hands steady on controls that felt like they might fail at any moment. The runway appeared ahead, emergency vehicles lining both sides, every emergency protocol activated for an aircraft attempting landing with catastrophic mechanical failures and temporary repairs that an engineer had jury-rigged during flight. 1 mile, Santos said. Gear coming down. The landing gear deployed with sounds that suggested things weren't moving smoothly, that hydraulic systems were stressed beyond normal parameters, that mechanical systems throughout the aircraft were being asked to perform in conditions they were never designed for. The control response changed exactly as Rachel had warned, suddenly mushier, less responsive, requiring Richardson to make rapid adjustments to maintain approach attitude. "You've got this," Rachel said quietly, her voice steady despite her bleeding hands and exhausted body. "Gentle flare, don't try to grease it. Get it on the ground and keep it straight. Pretty doesn't matter." Richardson brought the aircraft down the glide slope, fighting controls that wanted to wander, managing an approach that looked sloppy and dangerous from the ground but which represented the absolute maximum capability of the compromised systems. The runway rose up to meet them, concrete appearing huge in the windscreen, and Richardson pulled back on the yoke in a gentler-than-normal flare that still stressed Rachel's repairs in ways that made her wince. The main gear hit hard, much harder than a normal landing, the aircraft bouncing slightly before settling back onto the runway. Richardson deployed thrust reversers carefully, aware that asymmetric thrust could overwhelm his limited control authority. The aircraft rolled out down the centerline, decelerating in what looked from outside like a normal landing but which felt from inside like wrestling a wild animal that wanted to depart the runway at any moment. "We're down," Richardson said unnecessarily, his voice breaking with emotion as the aircraft slowed to taxi speed and he guided it carefully onto a taxiway where emergency vehicles swarmed around them. "We're actually down." The cabin behind them erupted in cheers, in crying, in emotional releases that came from people who'd believed absolutely they were going to die and who'd just discovered they would live. Flight attendants were sobbing with relief. Passengers were hugging strangers. The teenage girl who'd been hysterical with terror was laughing while tears streamed down her face. Everyone was alive because an anonymous passenger had shouted, "I can fix it," and then crawled into the mechanical guts of the aircraft to perform repairs that shouldn't have been possible. Richardson shut down the engines and turned in his seat to look at Rachel, who was leaning against the cockpit wall with exhaustion, her bleeding hands hanging at her sides, her clothes ruined with hydraulic fluid and mechanical grime. "Who are you?" he asked simply. "Dr. Rachel Martinez," she said tiredly. "Senior aerospace engineer, 15 years specializing in aircraft flight control mechanical systems. Former lead designer for military aircraft hydraulic actuator assemblies. I've performed emergency repairs on battle-damaged aircraft, but I never thought I'd be doing it on a commercial flight while we were flying." Santos was staring at the exposed mechanical systems that Rachel had worked on, at the improvised repairs visible through the access panel. "You did all that in 90 seconds. Closer to 2 minutes, but yes, Rachel confirmed. I compressed 15 years of expertise into the fastest emergency field repair I've ever attempted. And I violated about 1,000 proper maintenance procedures doing it. But the alternative was everyone dying, so I think the FAA will forgive the regulatory violations. The cockpit door opened and Captain's voice came over the intercom, shaky but grateful. Ladies and gentlemen, we've landed safely thanks to the intervention of a passenger who... I'm not even sure how to explain what just happened. We had catastrophic mechanical failures that should have made this aircraft uncontrollable. A passenger with engineering expertise accessed systems we didn't even know could be accessed during flight and performed repairs that saved everyone aboard. I don't have words adequate for what she did. Emergency crews were boarding, paramedics checking on passengers, FAA investigators already gathering to understand how an aircraft with catastrophic control failures had managed to land safely. Rachel was escorted to medical personnel who wanted to treat her bleeding hands, but she insisted on staying near the cockpit while maintenance technicians examined her improvised repairs. A senior maintenance inspector was staring into the access panel with an expression of utter disbelief. "This shouldn't be possible," he said quietly. "The repairs you made here, you created a manual hydraulic bypass using improvised materials while the aircraft was in flight. Do you understand that's supposed to require 3 qualified technicians with specialized tools working in a hangar for several hours?" "I understand that's the proper procedure," Rachel said calmly. "I also understand I had about 90 seconds and no tools except a fire extinguisher bracket and my belt. So I improvised." "Did it work?" "It worked," the inspector admitted. "It's a complete nightmare from a regulatory standpoint and I'll probably have to write the strangest maintenance report of my career, but it worked. You saved this aircraft and everyone on it." Passengers were deplaning slowly, many stopping to thank Rachel as they passed, though most had no real understanding of what she'd done beyond fixed the plane somehow. A few took pictures. Several asked for her contact information. A young mother with 2 children hugged her while crying. The businessman from seat 23 shook her hand and said, "I was sitting next to you the whole flight and had no idea you could do that." "Most people don't advertise their professional expertise while flying commercial," Rachel said with a tired smile. "I was just trying to read my thriller and drink mediocre coffee." Then the pilot said, 2 minutes and suddenly 15 years of aerospace engineering became immediately relevant. Captain Richardson found her as she was finally being released by medical personnel, her hands bandaged, her clothes still soaked with hydraulic fluid. He looked at her for a long moment, clearly trying to process what had happened. "I've been flying for 23 years, he said quietly. "I've trained for every emergency, practiced every procedure. But today I learned that sometimes training and procedures aren't enough. Sometimes you need someone who understands the actual mechanical systems, who can get their hands dirty, literally, and fix what's broken while we're in the air. You did something I didn't even know was possible." "It shouldn't be possible according to proper maintenance procedures," Rachel admitted. "What I did was dangerous and violated protocols that exist for good reasons. But we didn't have time for proper procedures. We had 2 minutes. So I did what needed to be done." 2 minutes, Richardson repeated, shaking his head. "When I made that announcement, I believed everyone was going to die. I'd accepted it. We were going to lose control completely and there was nothing I could do from my seat because the problem wasn't something I could fly around, it was physical mechanical destruction that flying skills couldn't fix. And then you shouted, 'I can fix it,' and I didn't believe you, but you did it anyway. You gave me the chance," Rachel said. "That flight attendant broke protocol opening the cockpit door. You let me access systems that passengers aren't supposed to touch. Everyone took risks trusting me. I just happened to have the exact expertise that matched the exact failure." Santos joined them, looking at Rachel with undisguised awe. "The maintenance inspector said your repairs should have taken hours with proper tools. You did it in 2 minutes with a fire extinguisher bracket in your belt." "How?" Rachel considered the question. 15 years of experience with these systems means I don't need to think about what connects to what, I know it instinctively. When I saw the failure pattern, I immediately understood what had broken, what was about to break, and what emergency interventions might buy us enough time to land. The actual mechanical work was just hands following knowledge that's been built over thousands of maintenance procedures. My hands knew what to do before my brain finished calculating whether it was theoretically possible. Muscle memory, Richardson said. Exactly. Except usually muscle memory involves routine maintenance in a hangar, not emergency repairs while the aircraft is plummeting and everyone's about to die. That part was new. The FAA investigators wanted detailed statements. Airline executives were already arriving to understand how catastrophic mechanical failures had resulted in safe landing. News media had learned about the passenger engineer who saved a commercial flight, and wanted interviews. Rachel found herself at the center of attention she'd never sought, explaining technical details to people who didn't quite understand the mechanical principles involved but who recognized that something extraordinary had occurred. The maintenance analysis took hours. Engineers examined Rachel's improvised repairs with professional fascination, documenting temporary linkages and manual hydraulic bypasses that existed in service manuals as theoretical emergency procedures but which nobody had ever actually performed during flight on a commercial aircraft. Her improvised binding using belt leather had held together a fractured actuator linkage under stresses that normally required precision-machined metal components. Her manual hydraulic rerouting had created fluid flow paths that the aircraft's automated systems should have established but which had failed during cascade malfunction. "You've basically rewritten the emergency procedures manual for this type of failure," a senior FAA engineer told her. "Everything you did was technically possible according to the mechanical principles of these systems, but we never seriously considered that someone could perform these interventions during flight without proper tools and preparation time. You've proven it's possible if you have someone with the right expertise and the willingness to work bare-handed in hydraulic assemblies while everyone's lives depend on you getting it perfect." Rachel flexed her bandaged hands. "I don't recommend it as standard procedure. My hands will hurt for weeks. But when the alternative is everyone dying, you work through the pain." Later that evening, after the media interviews and investigator statements and airline gratitude and passenger thanks, Rachel sat in a hotel room provided by American Airlines, showered clean of hydraulic fluid, wearing borrowed clothes because hers had been ruined. Her hands throbbed despite pain medication. Her body ached from the stress and physical exertion of emergency repairs performed under impossible conditions. But 246 people were alive, including her, because she'd shouted, "I can fix it," and then proven it. Her phone was buzzing constantly with messages from colleagues in the aerospace engineering community who'd heard the story, with former students congratulating her, with professional organizations wanting her to speak about the incident. She ignored most of it, too exhausted to engage with the sudden attention. What she kept thinking about was the 2 minutes. The moment when Captain Richardson had announced they had 2 minutes before complete control loss, when everyone aboard had believed they were going to die, when the standard procedures and pilot skills that normally kept aircraft safe had become meaningless because mechanical systems were literally breaking apart. In that moment, her 15 years of specialized expertise had transformed from career knowledge into immediate life-or-death relevance. She'd spent her entire career designing and maintaining systems that most people never thought about, mechanical linkages hidden behind smooth panels that passengers never saw. She'd performed countless maintenance procedures on aircraft in hangars, working carefully with proper tools and abundant time to ensure repairs met safety standards. She'd taught students about hydraulic systems and actuator assemblies and emergency procedures that existed more in textbooks than in reality. And then suddenly she'd been racing against a 90-second countdown with no tools and no preparation, crawling into exposed mechanical systems to perform repairs that her hands knew how to do but which her mind kept screaming were impossible under these conditions. The weight of 246 lives had focused everything she knew into 2 minutes of desperate mechanical intervention that shouldn't have worked but did. A soft knock on her hotel room door pulled her from reflection. She opened it to find Captain Richardson and First Officer Santos, both looking cleaned up and rested after their own debriefings. "We wanted to thank you properly," Richardson said. "Without the investigators and media and airline executives listening. What you did today saved my life, saved Maria's life, saved everyone aboard. We owe you everything." Rachel invited them in, and they sat in a small hotel room that felt too mundane for the conversation they were having. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't been on that flight," Santos said quietly. "If seat 23F had held someone with different expertise, or no special expertise at all, we would have crashed. Everyone would have died because I couldn't fix physical mechanical failures from the cockpit and you needed someone who could access those systems with hands-on knowledge. That's the terrifying part of aviation," Rachel admitted. "We design systems with redundancy, we train for emergencies, we practice procedures until they're instinctive. But sometimes catastrophic failures exceed all the planning and redundancy. Sometimes you need someone with specific expertise that exactly matches the specific failure. Today I happen to be that person. Tomorrow it might be someone else with different knowledge. We all carry specialized skills through our lives, never knowing if circumstances will ever demand we use them in ways we never expected." "Do you think you'll ever fly commercial again?" Richardson asked with a slight smile. "After today?" Rachel laughed tiredly. "Absolutely. I know exactly how over-engineered and safe these aircraft are. What happened today was extraordinarily rare, multiple simultaneous mechanical failures in patterns that overwhelmed redundancy systems. It's the nightmare scenario that designers try to prevent and that almost never actually occurs. I'll fly commercial again because I understand the math of aviation safety, even after today's terrifying deviation from that math." "The investigators found the root cause," Richardson said. "Apparently there was undetected fatigue cracking in a primary structural mount that holds the flight control actuator assembly in place. The crack had been growing for months, completely invisible to routine inspections because it was internal to the structure. Today it finally propagated to failure, and when that mount broke, it created a cascade where mechanical loads shifted to components that weren't designed to carry them. Everything started breaking in sequence. Which is exactly why we design redundant systems," Rachel said. "Except in this case, the redundancy failed faster than anyone anticipated because the failure mode was unusual. The backup systems couldn't handle the abnormal loads quickly enough." Santos shook her head with wonder. "And you just happened to be sitting in seat 23F. What are the odds?" "Astronomical," Rachel admitted. "I fly maybe 4 times a year for conferences. I almost didn't take this flight, I was considering driving instead because I had time. If I'd made a different choice, if I'd been on a different flight, if I'd been seated somewhere else, well, the outcome would have been very different." They sat in contemplative silence for a moment, each processing the random chance that had put the right person in the right place at the right time. Aviation was full of such moments, near misses that were avoided, disasters that were prevented, catastrophes that were narrowly escaped because the right combination of factors aligned at the critical moment. "The airline wants to recognize you formally," Richardson said. "They're talking about awards, public ceremonies, all the corporate gratitude stuff. I know that might not be what you want." "It's not," Rachel interrupted gently. "I didn't do this for recognition. I did it because 246 people were about to die including me, and I had knowledge that could prevent it. That's not heroism, that's just basic human response to crisis when you have relevant capabilities. Anyone with my training would have done the same thing." "Not anyone," Santos disagreed. "Someone else might have frozen, or doubted their knowledge, or hesitated because accessing those systems during flight is completely outside normal procedures. You didn't hesitate. You stood up, you shouted for access, and you did what needed to be done despite the risks and the protocol violations and the possibility of failure. That's courage, even if you don't want to call it heroism." Rachel flexed her bandaged hands, feeling the ache that would remind her of this day for weeks to come. "I was terrified the entire time I was working on those systems. Every second, I was thinking, what if I'm wrong, what if this doesn't work, what if I make it worse?" The fear was overwhelming. But the alternative was doing nothing while everyone died, and I couldn't accept that alternative when I had knowledge that might help. That's the definition of courage, Richardson said quietly. Not the absence of fear, but action despite fear. You were terrified and you did it anyway. A long pause stretched between them, filled with the weight of shared experience that civilians could never quite understand, the knowledge of how close they'd all come to death, how random factors had saved them, how fragile life was at 39,000 feet when mechanical systems failed in catastrophic ways. I need to ask you something, Rachel said finally. When I shouted, "I can fix it," did you believe me? In that moment, did you actually think a passenger engineer could save the aircraft, or did you let me try because there was nothing left to lose? Richardson considered the question carefully. Honestly, I didn't believe it was possible. I thought you were experiencing some kind of panic response, that you were grasping at solutions that couldn't work. But then you started using technical terminology that proved you actually understood flight control systems, and Jennifer, the flight attendant, made the call to open the cockpit door, and at that point I figured we were dying anyway, so why not let you try? I didn't believe you could succeed. I just didn't have a better option than letting you attempt the impossible. Fair enough, Rachel said with a slight smile. I barely believed it myself. The procedures I implemented, they exist in theory, they're documented in emergency maintenance manuals, but nobody seriously expects to perform them during flight. We practice them in training simulators where we have tools and time and backup if things go wrong. I was working blind with improvised materials in conditions that training never covered. Every moment, I expected to fail. But you didn't fail, Santos said. Your hands knew what to do even when your mind was screaming that it was impossible. That's expertise, the kind of deep knowledge that becomes instinct. Rachel nodded slowly. 15 years of working on these systems. Thousands of hours in maintenance hangars, teaching students, designing improvements, troubleshooting problems. All of that accumulated knowledge compressed into 90 seconds of desperate improvisation. I couldn't have done it when I was younger, fresh out of engineering school with theoretical knowledge but no practical experience. The hands-on expertise came from years of repetition, of making mistakes in safe conditions and learning from them, of developing intuitive understanding of how mechanical systems behave under stress. Will this change your career? Richardson asked. After today, you're going to be famous in aerospace engineering circles. The woman who saved Flight 1843 by performing emergency repairs that shouldn't be possible. That opens doors. Rachel thought about it. Maybe. Probably. I'll get speaking invitations, consulting opportunities, job offers from companies that want to associate with the story. But fundamentally, I'm still the same engineer I was yesterday. I didn't discover new knowledge today, I applied existing expertise in an unusual situation. The mechanical principles I used have been understood for decades. I just happened to be the person who needed to apply them under extreme conditions. Don't sell yourself short, Santos said firmly. What you did today will be studied by aerospace engineers and safety investigators for years. You've proven that emergency repairs are possible in conditions that everyone assumed made such repairs impossible. That changes how we think about survivability of catastrophic failures. They talked for another hour, processing the trauma and adrenaline of the day, sharing perspectives that helped each of them understand the event from different angles. Richardson described how it felt to lose control authority progressively, to feel the aircraft becoming less responsive with every passing second, to announce 2 minutes, while believing those were the last words many passengers would remember him saying. Santos talked about the moment Rachel's repairs started working, the sudden return of control response that had felt like a miracle, the desperate concentration required to help Richardson manage the emergency landing with compromised systems. Rachel shared her perspective from behind the captain's seat, the visceral terror of working on exposed mechanical systems while the aircraft descended, the bleeding hands and improvised tools and desperate calculations of whether temporary repairs could hold long enough. They created shared narrative from individual experiences, building collective understanding of an event that had been too chaotic and terrifying to fully process while it was happening. Eventually Richardson and Santos left, thanking Rachel again, promising to stay in touch, acknowledging the bond that forms between people who survive crisis together. Rachel was alone again with her thoughts, her bandaged hands, and the growing realization that today would define how many people saw her for the rest of her career. The next morning brought media chaos. News crews outside the hotel, reporters wanting interviews, aviation safety advocates wanting her to speak about the importance of engineering expertise, airlines wanting to understand if her techniques could be standardized into procedures. Rachel handled it with the same calm competence she'd shown in the cockpit, giving measured interviews that focused on the technical aspects rather than dramatizing the personal heroism angle. "I'm an aerospace engineer who happened to be on a flight that experienced catastrophic mechanical failures," she told reporters. "My professional expertise matched the specific problem. I did what my training and experience prepared me to do. The real story here isn't about me, it's about the importance of robust engineering, redundant safety systems, and the value of hands-on expertise in crisis situations." But the media loved the human angle too much to let it go. "Passenger engineer saves 246 lives," became the headline. She shouted, "I can fix it," and saved everyone aboard, appeared in aviation publications. Video of Rachel deplaning with bandaged, bloodied hands went viral. She became, despite her protests, a symbol of expertise in action, of professional competence meeting desperate need, of the value of specialized knowledge when crisis exceeds routine procedures. The aerospace engineering community responded with professional fascination. Her university colleagues analyzed the repairs she'd performed, documenting the improvised techniques for academic study. Aircraft manufacturers reviewed her methods to understand if emergency access panels could be improved for better crisis intervention. Safety investigators incorporated her experience into training materials showing that catastrophic failures sometimes require unconventional solutions from people with specialized expertise. 3 weeks later, Rachel was invited to speak at the annual Aerospace Engineering Conference in Seattle. She stood before an audience of 800 engineering professionals and described the technical details of her emergency repairs, the hydraulic rerouting, the improvised linkage binding, the manual bypass configurations that had given the pilots enough control authority to land safely. Her presentation was dense with mechanical principles and engineering calculations, showing precisely why her interventions had worked despite violating proper maintenance procedures. During the question period, a young engineering student raised her hand. "Dr. Martinez, when you were performing those repairs, knowing that everyone's life depended on you getting it perfect, how did you manage the pressure? How did you keep working when the stakes were so impossibly high?" Rachel paused, remembering the terror and focus of those 90 seconds. "I didn't manage the pressure, I accepted it. There was no time to worry about the stakes or process the fear. My hands moved through procedures they'd performed thousands of times, my mind calculated solutions based on 15 years of experience, and I focused on the immediate mechanical problems rather than the larger context of everyone dies if I fail." You can't work effectively while thinking about catastrophic consequences. You have to narrow your focus to the immediate technical challenges and trust that your expertise will guide you through them. Another engineer asked about the regulatory implications. "You violated multiple FAA maintenance procedures during your repairs. There are rules about who can work on aircraft systems, about required tools and documentation, about proper authorization before accessing critical mechanical assemblies. How do you address those violations?" "I violated every rule," Rachel acknowledged frankly. "And I'd do it again in identical circumstances. Regulations exist for excellent reasons. They ensure safety during routine operations, they prevent unqualified intervention, they maintain accountability. But regulations aren't suicide pacts. When catastrophic failure creates situations where following rules means everyone dies, you make the choice to violate rules and accept the consequences later. The FAA investigated my actions and concluded that emergency necessity justified the regulatory violations. I'd rather face administrative penalties than live knowing I let 246 people die because I was worried about proper paperwork." The audience applauded, recognizing the moral clarity of her position. A senior aerospace executive asked the question that many were thinking, should we train commercial pilots to perform the kinds of repairs you did? Should we develop standardized procedures for passenger intervention in mechanical failures? Rachel shook her head firmly. No. What I did was dangerous and should remain a last resort exception rather than standard procedure. Commercial pilots need to focus on flying the aircraft, not on crawling into mechanical assemblies during flight. The repairs I performed required very specialized expertise that took 15 years to develop. You can't quickly train that level of hands-on mechanical knowledge. What today proved is that sometimes catastrophic situations require specialized intervention from people with relevant expertise. But you can't plan for that, you can't ensure that every flight carries an engineer with the exact knowledge needed for whatever specific failure might occur. What we should do is continue improving aircraft reliability and redundancy so that catastrophic mechanical failures become even rarer than they already are. The conference continued with technical discussions about failure analysis, improved inspection techniques to catch fatigue cracking before it becomes critical, and enhanced redundancy in flight control systems. Rachel's emergency repairs became a case study in engineering education, an example of expertise applied under extreme pressure, of improvisation within technical constraints, of human capability exceeding what procedures and regulations normally allow. But for Rachel, the most meaningful recognition came not from professional organizations or media attention or academic analysis. It came 3 months after the incident, when she received a handwritten letter from the teenage girl who'd been hysterical with fear in seat 12B during those terrible 2 minutes when everyone believed they were going to die. The letter was simple and profound. Dr. Martinez, I'm Emily. I was on flight 1843. I was so scared I couldn't breathe. I was crying and thinking about everything I'd never get to do, everyone I'd never see again. And then I heard you shouting, I can fix it, and I didn't believe you, nobody believed you, but you did it anyway. You saved my life. You saved my parents' lives, they were sitting next to me. You saved everyone. I'm 17 years old and I've decided to study engineering because of you. I want to be someone who can shout, I can fix it, when things seem impossible. I want to have knowledge that saves people. Thank you for showing me what expertise really means. Thank you for giving me a future I thought I'd lost. Thank you for not giving up even when nobody believed you. You're my hero. Rachel kept that letter on her office desk, reading it whenever she felt tired or questioned whether her career mattered. Emily's words reminded her why she'd spent 15 years developing expertise in mechanical systems that most people never thought about, because someday, somehow, that knowledge might be exactly what was needed to save lives. 6 months after the incident, Flight 1843's investigation concluded officially. The fatigue cracking in the structural mount had been caused by a manufacturing defect invisible to standard inspections. The manufacturer implemented new inspection protocols for that component across their entire fleet. The backup systems that had failed under abnormal loads were redesigned to handle wider ranges of stress conditions. Rachel's emergency repair techniques were documented in engineering literature as theoretical emergency procedures that had been validated under real crisis conditions. Captain Richardson and First Officer Santos returned to flying, their careers marked by the incident but not defined by it. They became advocates for improved communication between cockpit crews and passengers with specialized expertise, arguing that aviation safety should include protocols for identifying and utilizing passenger capabilities during emergencies that exceed standard crew training. And Rachel returned to her normal life, teaching aerospace engineering, consulting on aircraft design projects, conducting research into improved flight control systems. She flew commercial regularly, never worried about routine flights, understanding that what happened on Flight 1843 was the kind of rare catastrophic failure that statistics said shouldn't occur but sometimes did anyway. She thought about those 2 minutes often. The moment when Captain Richardson had announced they were dying. The decision to stand up and shout when everyone around her was accepting death. The desperate sprint to the cockpit. The exposed mechanical systems and bleeding hands and improvised repairs performed while terror threatened to overwhelm her. The impossible success when temporary fixes held long enough to land safely. Those 2 minutes had transformed abstract engineering expertise into immediate life-saving action. They'd proven that specialized knowledge accumulated over careers could become instantly essential when circumstances aligned in catastrophic ways. They'd demonstrated that sometimes the difference between survival and disaster was having the right person in the right place who was willing to violate procedures and take enormous risks because the alternative was unacceptable. Rachel never called herself a hero. She'd just been a passenger with relevant expertise who'd recognized a problem she knew how to address. But to 246 people who'd believed they were going to die, to the pilots who'd lost control of their aircraft, to the families who'd nearly lost loved ones, she was exactly that, a hero who'd shouted, "I can fix it," in humanity's darkest moment and then proven those words with bleeding hands and desperate improvisation and 15 years of engineering knowledge compressed into 90 seconds that saved everyone. The Boeing 777 that had been Flight 1843 was eventually repaired properly, with correct procedures and proper tools and abundant time. The temporary linkages Rachel had rigged were removed and replaced with precision-manufactured components. The aircraft returned to service, carrying passengers who never knew about the day when catastrophic failures had nearly killed everyone aboard, when a passenger engineer had crawled into the mechanical systems and performed repairs that shouldn't have been possible. But Rachel knew. Captain Richardson knew. First Officer Santos knew. And 246 passengers knew that sometimes ordinary flights become extraordinary crises, that sometimes hidden expertise becomes immediately essential, and that sometimes survival depends on someone being willing to stand up and shout, "I can fix it," even when nobody believes it's possible, and then proving it with hands-on action while everyone's life depends on getting it perfect on the first attempt. 2 minutes. That's how long they'd had between death and survival. And Rachel Martinez, aerospace engineer, had compressed 15 years of expertise into those 2 minutes and saved everyone aboard through knowledge, courage, and the willingness to violate every rule when the alternative was letting 246 people die. She'd shouted, "Open the cockpit, I can fix it." And against all odds, she had.